Volume 7 C83. Pretending to be bad? Raymond asked when she looked him over again for what he was sure was the third time.
Yes, Nua said. She took a half step, hesitated, then strode toward him. Pretending. Go on. Beat me. Hit me. Slap me around.
Raymond,
she said his name, dripping it from her tongue. I just used your name without calling you master, at the very least you should be.
She walked away, snatched the horsewhip from the corner and thrust it toward him.
I know the position,
Raymond, she said, and went to the wall.
He was frozen,
staring down at the whip that his fingers unconsciously closed around when she placed it there.
But her nimble fingers unlaced her shirt and cast it aside at his feet. Her hands went to the wood, spread just a little more than shoulder width apart so that her back in all its vicious history was laid bare.
Raymond, she said it again.
In the slain theocracy I'd be lashed
till I fell to my knees for such disrespect as using my master's name without his title.
If you're not just playing at being bad, then prove it. He stared down at the whip,
then at the crisscrossed map of scars that ran up and down her body. He could picture it clean,
how smooth it must have been. She was pale there, for a wood elf, which marked her as someone who worked indoors a great deal. She's right. I should. This is how it is.
She's a slave who disrespected me, he told himself with an empty hollowness to his thoughts even while he looked down at the lash in his hands. He looked at the trail of marks, like a wild mountain range of ugly flesh, jagged, broken and grown over.
She's just daring me to add more.
Is she insane?
No, she isn't. He realized.
Her breathing was slow and steady, calm and without fear now, far from when he stood over her with the knife in his hand.
I don't want to, he said, staring down at the whip.
Am I not chattel? Am I not rebellious chattel that dares to disrespect you, a superior human, Raymond?
Nua provoked him further, his name dripping from her tongue. She didn't break position.
Aren't you called by your gods to punish me? Maybe you prefer to blame a curse nobody can find? Maybe call someone else to do it if you can't. She spat onto his floor.
I'm the enemy of mankind. She repeated the words he commanded her to say. I'm the enemy of mankind, she said it again.
His breath began to quicken as she spoke.
Be quiet, he said in a small voice, his eyes staring down at the whip and then back to the slave. You told me to say it. I'm the enemy of all mankind, she shouted it back at him, looking over her shoulder at last.
Shut up, he yelled at her. What are you playing at? Why are you doing this? Do you want me to beat you bloody? He roared back at her and flung the whip down at her feet. It skittered across the floor and stopped at the wall, streaking her spit with it until it came to a thudding stop.
No,
Raymond, she spat his name like a curse.
I want you to stop playing games.
He was struck by the steel of the blue in her eyes as ferocity like a warrior met him.
You're telling the truth. You don't want to. But why?
This isn't a master not in the mood to discipline his property.
That's what you're trying to tell yourself. I hate hypocrites.
At least Dominic was honest. She spat on the whip and whirled on him, heedless of the fact that she was naked from the waist up. She took long, bold steps, and raising her hand, she struck him across the face as hard as she could, snapping his head to one side.
There,
she snapped at him and looked him square in the eye.
Now, tell the truth. Why don't you want to? Why aren't you picking up that lash?
She yelled an inch from his face and pointed behind her, breathing hard and tears of rage in her eyes. Because you're beautiful. I don't want to hurt you. Isn't that enough? He snapped and stepped back away from her. Isn't that enough? Most elves in the slain theocracy dance for joy about that. He threw up his hands and grabbed his thick brown hair. So you want to fuck me? She crossed her arms in front of her chest and stared at him with neither desire nor fear in her eyes, her feet shoulder width apart. It was he who blushed and she who showed no mercy in her steel blue eyes. So just tell me, you won't be the first person an elf woman has pretended she didn't loathe.
I've got your number now, Raymond. No games. No obfuscation, no hiding or disguises. You know I know. No, it's not that. I just...
He closed his eyes, his hands fell together between his knees as he fell back into the chair. He didn't look up at her.
It's wrong. All right. I saw the way you looked. I didn't see what I've always seen. Your race. You're just background to me, you always have been. I had none of you growing up,
traveled too much to bother owning any. I never cared for brothels. He chuckled, even the others all say I'm addicted to my work. So you never had to actually hurt one of my kind before. Nua stepped away and turned her back to him. She began to pace and lowered her eyes. She closed them and inhaled deeply through her nose, placing thumb and forefinger over her forehead as if it ached. She exhaled as heavily as she inhaled. This explains a lot. You really have been just playing at evil. And innocent, like I first thought before you first reached out to mutilate me. She noticed how he winced when she used the word mutilate so casually. So, I suppose that means you're not just going to screw me either, she said and turned a side eye to him. No. I've never had an elven mistress before, he said, raising his face to look at her as she paced back and forth on steady steps. We have a different way of describing our place in that arrangement. Usually, she said with a scathing voice that dripped sarcasm like acid. He could only look down again in answer. So, what do we do now? She asked him as she came to a dead stop. You can start by picking up your shirt and putting it on, he said, managing a chuckle when she looked down and realized she'd been so caught up in the moment that she'd forgotten all that she'd done to provoke him. Damn it. She cursed and bent down to do as he said. She started to lace up the front of her shirt while facing him, and he had the decency to look away from her while she did it. I meant other than that. Am I still just a dangerous animal in your eyes, Raymond? She asked him. He said nothing. She came close, crouched down so she was beneath his lowered gaze, and reaching up to touch the other side of his cheek, she gently pushed him center face so that he was looking at her again. Am I your enemy? Like you said. Do I deserve to suffer or die? Do you really believe it? Can you honestly say those scars are well placed? The truth. Please. No more games. It's just me. When you take me back to your country and give me back to Dominic, there's nobody I can tell. Nobody will believe me even if I did. But while we're alone, do you want me to beg? No. He muttered. He tried to tear his gaze from hers, and couldn't. Then tell me, she whispered her urgings. Her fingers quavered against his cheek while her eyes searched his own. No. No, you don't. You aren't. I'm sure you couldn't have deserved whatever was done to put those there. I tried to convince myself. I failed. If the gods are testing me. I failed, he said, and resting his elbows on his knees, he held his head and stared down between his feet. Maybe you didn't, maybe you passed. Maybe you're one of the few in your country to ever pass. Nu answered, but what will you do with me now? Send me back? Back to Dominic? She swallowed the lump in her throat and felt it settle in her gut. I don't know. I'll talk to him. Raymond looked away from her. If it weren't for that, I could just. But then she's as good as dead. He mouthed a slew of coarse words as two blue seas hovered just out of view. He could feel that staring, wondering at him. You'll stay. Stay with me. He cleared his throat and forced himself to look at her. You'll stay with me for now. I'll work something out. Right. She rose to her feet, and it was her turn to look away. I suppose. You're not all I thought. I will address you as I should in public. But when we are alone? She asked the question and he answered her. It was softly said, but it was said. You are Nua. I am Raymond. He then rubbed the cheek she'd slapped earlier and actually let out a laugh, and Nua has fast hands. He then enjoyed the way her smile lit up the room. After which Raymond stood up and said, Come with me, we've got somewhere to be. Let me do that. Layali shot out the words and rushed on the longest steps she could take, to seize the spit away from Brain before he could stick the meat on it. Her little hands snatched the spit away, but the meat was out of reach. Until she jumped up and took it from his hand. Brain didn't resist her actions, he allowed her to take both from him. We had a deal, she insisted in her indignant little girl pitch, and she impaled the flesh on the long wooden pole and then slapped it down on the stakes, holding it over where she would light the fire, and put her hands on her hips. There. Besides, I've gotten better than you at this, she said with a cocky little smile and a sharp nod that fairly dared him to argue. I don't know about that. He dared to venture. HMPF. She turned up her nose. Zeshi, what do you say, who is the better cook? Zeshi dutifully extended a finger and pointed to Layali. Definitely you. She tried not to mimic the girl's smirk too much, and Brain ran with it. Fine. Who am I to argue with the only two girls around? I know that's a losing game if ever there was one. He made a dramatic show of throwing his hands up at the sky and letting out an exasperated breath as they laughed, and went about setting up camp. The bedrolls were laid out in short order, and while Layali completed her final tasks and saw to cooking their meal, Zeshi continued her instruction of the human swordsman. Sweat flew from his hair as it was cast off, or ran down his face as the half-elf effortlessly pushed him beyond his limits. The black and white hair trailed high in the wind as their speeds accelerated far beyond what Layali could follow. Brain's broken sword lay cast aside as he learned something of hand-to-hand combat. He tumbled backwards and slid to a stop, gasping for breath after Zeshi's fist connected to his solar plexus. He gasped and held the injured spot. The prior injuries she'd inflicted on him. They still ached, though he didn't reveal it. He went limp as she approached him. "You're getting a little bit better," she said as her hand extended to within reach of him. He tilted his head back and waved off her hand while he chuckled and gasped at the same moment. "Give me a minute," he said while he rubbed the spot she struck. "That'll leave a bruise," he said before adding, "I may be improving, but I'm just plain better with a sword." "You got a couple of hits in." Zeshi contradicted his self-criticism as he rolled himself over and pushed himself up to his feet. He grunted when he was still on all fours, "Only because you let me." "True," she acknowledged as he got all the way up, then leveled a finger at him, "but that would always be true. I'm unique. And I limited myself to the skills of some of my countries. I mean, the slain theocracy's finest. You're nowhere near on par with Senna. But you might be around as fast as Raymond," and he trained Senna. He used to be, when he was younger, one of the most lethal members of the Black Scripture. "Raymond? Your handler, the one you were with before, the old man? That old man?" Brain looked at her with cockeyed incredulity. "I figured he could fight some, but that guy?" Zeshi looked back the way they'd come. Yeah, he was. He called me pretty after I put him on his ass when we met. He was younger than you are now, but he and Senna were the ones I knew best. The others? Comrades, sure. But those two I could always count on. He was a vicious and savage killer when he had to be. I remember this one time, we were hunting down a vampire that had taken a few villagers. Just a training exercise for me, but he captured the vampire, beat it to a bloody pulp, and then skinned it till it told him what he wanted to know. When it came to looking out for his own, you'd think he was a little demon. But to me, he was always asking if I was okay, if I was happy. He was like a father or uncle or something. I liked that. "You're young," he said, and she put her hands on her hips to stare at him as if he were an idiot, as half-elves go. "That is," he said, and she relaxed a little. "It's not that surprising he'd take on that role without thinking about it. It happens in villages sometimes too. I saw it growing up before I left." "Say, your family never objected to you just leaving?" Zeshi asked as she thought that over. "The dead never object to anything," Brain said. "Let's call it quits for now. Since we'll be in Kani tomorrow, I want to be well rested. I'll need to buy some supplies and see if I can find somewhere suitable for Layali." The half-elf girl froze, except for her mouth. Her lips quivered a little as she mouthed her objections. But, you're going to our winter. And you were going to face Cerebrate and you're still coming with me that far." Brain promised. He went over to where she stood, her arm moving and turning the spit as smoke from the fire rose up and shrouded the meat. The smell was enough to make Brain's stomach growl. He tousled her hair and said, "I know some things just have to be done. But if I can find somewhere safe for you there, I won't have to wait until the last minute." But her eyes began to well up. "It's what's best," he said, and she hung her head. "Is the food almost ready? It smells fantastic." He tried to form a bright smile down at her and rubbed his stomach while licking his lips. "Why yeah, I tried something different with those spices you gave me." She perked up. "If I just do enough for him, then he won't leave me." She reassured herself and forced a grin to her face as she raised up to her tiptoes to encourage his continued tussling of her hair. Volume 7 C84. "What are we doing here, my lord?" Nu asked as they stood in front of the orphanage. It wasn't a large building, being only 2 stories and made of logs sealed together with pitch. But it was wide and deep. "Getting your replacement," Raymond replied. Noah stopped dead. You're going to let me go?" "For the carriage. You will ride with me. Raymond replied without looking at her a second time. I understand. Nua replied to him and lowered her eyes. But how will an orphanage help? They have no slaves here, but because of how many were killed in the Allfather's War there were many orphans. The frogmen slew large numbers of border villagers, the knights left behind wives and children, a great many of their young ended up here or in places like it. Raymond explained to her, and watched the dawning light in her eyes. He went on, when they get older, they're released from the orphanage, and there's always ones who struggle to find work. He reached the door and pulled it open while Nua followed behind him. The floor was of varnished wood, and the door opened to a wide entryway with a single desk at the center where an aged human woman sat scribbling something on some papers in front of her. When Raymond and Nua entered, she set the quill into her inkwell and looked up at him. Her hair was short and grey and done in a tight bun, her features were wrinkled and her hooked nose was distinctly crone-like. Name and purpose, she said, clearly by rote. Raymond and Nua. We're here to acquire someone. Raymond explained. Are you looking for a boy, a girl? And for what purpose? Do you have a farm? Do you need a wife for you, a husband for her, or are you seeking an apprentice for your craft? Be specific, please. She folded her hands together and though he couldn't see it, he could hear her foot tapping beneath her thick wooden desk. A driver for my carriage. Raymond almost stammered the words but he cleared his throat. Boy or girl will be fine as long as they're old enough to look after themselves when not driving. I see. Do you want a labor contract then? She asked, something long-term? I want no questions, but in addition. He answered with a shake of his head, some experience is preferred, but not vital, Nua can train them. I see. Very well, I can select a few who are about to be removed from here. The old woman replied and pushed herself up from the desk. Please wait where you are, I will bring out the most promising. She took up a walking stick that leaned against her desk and carried herself down the hall and into a door large enough for one single person to pass through. They heard her muffled voice, and Nua's ears twitched a bit before she went completely stiff at his back. He could feel her eyes on him, and her unhappiness. There was no chance to discuss it as the old woman emerged again. This time she had 3 young people in tow. They were young humans, 2 male and a female, Nua noticed, and they shuffled out behind the old woman with eyes downcast and with small, shuffling steps. They were clad in relatively cheap clothing, simple brown shirts and pants that must have been white once, but had faded to grey. Their hair was closely cropped to their heads, though not completely shaved, and was uniformly brown. Their shoes were not in the best condition, being simply leather strips nailed into wood with laces over the top to hold the 2 wrapping sides together. Notably, they were at least personally clean. These 3 are due to leave tomorrow, but you can have 1 or more of them today. However, there is the matter of. She held up her withered hand and rubbed her thumb, 4, and middle fingers together, coin. You see, caring for children is such a costly enterprise, and we do so want the best for them even after they leave us. So, expenses must be paid for. Raymond looked the trio over. You, girl. What's your name? The cardinal pointed to her. She raised her eyes. Cilia, she said and snapped her eyes back down when she saw his stern countenance. You, boy? He asked and pointed to the young man to her left. Soren. The boy muttered. He too darted his eyes up and then back down again. And you? Raymond spoke to the last. Laws. It was a slightly deeper voice, but only just. Triplets? He asked as he looked them over. Yes, sir. The bigger of the trio uttered. Father died in the war. Mother died after. Lost the farm. Debt's too big. Ended up here. I see. Raymond muttered. He rubbed his beard. I planned on only getting 1. But I budgeted more for this journey than I needed. You 3 were farmers, you say? Yes, sir. Laws answered. Which of you can drive a carriage and work with horses? Raymond asked the most pointed question, and scanned the trio. Nua stood still, silent. A well of pity rose in the elf to watch the 3 young people considered as they were, almost like livestock themselves. I can, sir. I was the best at it. Cilia's hand went up with a hesitant half gesture as if she wasn't sure whether her answer was wise or not. Her eyes darted left and right, but she hastened to add, I was the best at it. I drove the cart at least, never a carriage, and I know how to take care of horses real good. They like me. A smile more fragile than glass formed on her face and then fell apart under the weight of Raymond's steady examination. He looked past them toward the old woman. "I'll take all three. And tell me where I can purchase some farmland on our way to the next large city." Peronia is 2 days' travel from here by a swift carriage ride. "The land there is very good," she said, and watched as his hand vanished into his pouch and 3 gold coins emerged. "That's each," she said, and licked her lips. "No, it isn't," Raymond retorted and held the coins out. She snatched them away, her mouth opened for a moment, and then spoke to the trio. "You're his problem now," she said, and the trio lowered their eyes to his feet. "Follow," Raymond replied, and as they followed with a steady trudge, with Nua taking up the rear position, he said, "Laws, Soren, how quickly can you acquire a pair of horses and a cart if you have the money?"
2 hours.
"Sir, maybe less if we don't haggle," Laws answered, his voice going deeper as his confidence went up. "Good." Raymond drew out a handful of coins from his pouch. "Go purchase a cart and 2 horses, and supplies enough for the 5 of us, but see that there's ample remainder." He then turned to Cilia. "You, Cilia, go with Nua, show her what you know and take instructions from her as needed. Be ready to drive my carriage by the time your brothers get back." "Yes, sir," the trio said, and Raymond stood aside to watch as they followed his instructions. Nua kept glancing back at him as she led the girl over to the carriage. Confusion etched on her face while Raymond stood with seeming indifference and waited. Laws proved to be less than accurate. He and his brother returned within the hour, and Nua presented herself to her master just as they pulled up in an old cart drawn by 2 young horses. The creatures snorted and pawed at the ground, and Laws patted several sacks behind him. "Sir, we've got enough food here for a good long time." Soren spoke for his big brother and Raymond pointed to the carriage. "Nua, get in. Cilia, drive. Laws and Soren, follow. We're following this road all the way to Peronia." When they were alone inside the carriage, Nua sat across from him and crossed her arms. Neither spoke until the carriage lurched forward, after which she spoke. "So, let's talk, Raymond." "Yes, let's," he said and slapped his hands down onto his knees. "You don't like what happened there?" He guessed. "It may not be a slave auction, but if you'd asked for them to be stripped and show their teeth, I think the old woman would have done it." Nua answered and narrowed her eyes. "First, I want to know how you knew. Second, why all 3? And the extra horses, and all those supplies? Are you planning something lewd with that girl?" She raised her golden brow at him until he leaned back in his seat. "Because we planned out my path of travel long before I got here. So of course we investigated the local laws and issues. Orphans are a problem between both the Kingdom of Kani and the Kingdom of Nazarick. Both wars made a lot of orphans and they end up in places like that. These are actually fairly nice, these are at least fed. They end up getting adopted for money, or taken on as apprentices, but it's really just cheap labor. They work farms, they work for smiths or whatever. I suppose I should be impressed that these places do as much as they are. But at the end of the day, children with no parents are a commodity." Nua looked at him long and hard, her eyes never blinked. "I'm not endorsing this, only telling you how it is," Raymond said after the stare lingered for too long. The carriage bounced around a little as Cilia showed her skill might have been slightly overstated. "So?" Nua prompted. "I'll keep Cilia as a driver for the duration and you'll be more of a personal attendant. In Peronia I'll buy a farm and let the brothers work it. On the way back, I will leave Cilia with them. If I don't return in a few years, I'll tell them the farm is theirs," Raymond said and glanced out the window to watch the distant lands pass by. "So, you're letting them go?" Nua answered. "Of course," Raymond said as if it were self-evident. "But not me?" Nua asked. Her crossed arms tightened. "No," Raymond replied. "They're humans from a foreign country. You're a slave of Cardinal Dominic Herapartouche." Nua took that in with great calm. "So, you're going to give me back to Dominic? You know what he's going to do to me. You know talking to him won't stop it. Maybe I can buy you from him, tell him I've grown fond of you. He might laugh, but I don't think he would mind." Raymond pointed out. "What if I don't want that? What if I don't want to end up as? I don't have a future there, Raymond," she asserted with an edge to her voice while she ground her teeth. "I'll treat you well, I have only humans in my employ. But you know I won't hurt you. I won't force you to do anything. He tried to reassure her, but she inched away from him on the seat.
"You're making me go back," she said pointedly, and he nodded.
"Of course I am. I have a favorable view of you," he said, and shifted a little under her with a ring stare. "Lucky me." Nua dripped the words from her tongue. "I'm so well loved by my master that he'll keep me as his personal pet so his friend doesn't make me scream."
"You could just
stop the carriage and let me go."
"I'm not going to do that," Raymond said. "What kind of monster do you take me for?"
"A monster? For letting me go?" Nua asked. "What are you talking about?" "If I release you, you're as good as dead," Raymond said, and the cold silence thawed as the fires of confusion warred on Nua's face. "Why do you think Dominic sent a broken-in elf?" Raymond asked her and then leaned forward. "Because you're easy to hunt outside the theocracy. Wood elves are found in only a few places, and you may hide well in shadows, but not in populations. If you run, the Aganti will hunt you down, or the half-elves will. If I try to tell them you're dead," he pointed to the collar around her neck, "he'll know you're still alive. Why do you think you never hear of high-placed elf slaves just making a run for it, or betraying their owners? Enchantments like this are rare and expensive. But for the ones who attend cardinals directly, you can expect it." So I'm." Nua's face paled. "It's worse than you thought." "Yes. I'm sorry. The best I can do is make sure you don't go back to him. After that, once you're in my house, I can make some kind of an arrangement." "But you are still leashed to Dominic whether you're with him or not," Raymond said and looked away from her. I am truly sorry." "What if I tried to appeal to one of the leaders we're going to see?" Nua asked, then shook her head at her own question. No nation is going to start a conflict over one woman. I'm alone. Completely alone," she whispered. No, you're not. I'll protect you. It's the least I can do after the things I tried to do to you. I'll never forgive myself for that. Never, not if I live to be 10,000 years old," Raymond said to her with a pallid expression of utter horror as his own memories tore at his conscience. "I'll believe it when I see it, Raymond," Nua said, though her crossed arms relaxed a little. "If I could do anything." "Do you have any ideas?" he asked, half in accusation, but to her credit, Nua looked him in the eyes to answer. "No. So, for now, I'll play my role with you in public and in private we're what? And don't say Raymond and Nua. You know that's not what I mean. Just think of us as colleagues. For now?" Raymond suggested, and Nua gave that a slow, measured nod. "I can accept that. On one condition," Nua said, and Raymond waited for her to name it. "Teach me how to use that knife," she said, and Raymond quickly nodded in assent to her wishes. "Consider it done," he said. Their travel after that was swift, with the drivers operating in shifts. They reached the city of Peronia in the Kingdom of Nazarick, acquired a good plot of land with a small hut. In need of some repair, lay waiting, and in short order, two brothers were left behind with horses and supplies and watched their sister drive the carriage away. "Do you think they'll worry about her?" Raymond asked as he looked out the back window. The two boys were already beginning to work with the supplies they'd acquired from Raymond, and their lingering eyes became far more fleeting and then stopped entirely long before his carriage was out of sight. "No. They assume you're sleeping with me," Nua answered without a smile on her face. "Oh," he answered while keeping his face completely blank. "They believed me completely when I told them so," Nua answered with her face just as blank as his. "So, now what?" she asked and began to look out the window. "The carriage has a scribble kit under the seat. We'll be meeting with the other national leaders today to get an update on the search for the missing Queen Drawdillon. I'm sure my colleagues are furious at my decision to let non-humans roam my country, but..." He almost laughed, briefly tightening his lips together to stifle it. "I also know that they had no better ideas on how to salvage the situation. Especially since they were mostly at fault." "How's that, Raymond?" Nua had to ask, her curiosity piqued at the rare insight into the decisions of those who ruled her personal hell. The Draconic Queen was distancing herself from us politically. Trade terms were tightening to become more favorable to her country than to ours, and they were no longer selling land to our nobles. Raymond explained, but Nua only stared blankly. "Right. You wouldn't know," he muttered. "Our nobles used to buy and trade Draconic Kingdom land in the danger zones. places that could be farmed, and more importantly, rented. When the beastmen invaded, we would buy it up cheaply. When they went back, we would sell the land for a profit to those who were desperate for a place to farm, or more commonly rent it for high prices, and the nobles would trade it among themselves like currency. He watched Nua's eyes spark with understanding. I see, so it kept a lot of money flowing west into your country's hands, I'll bet. Money that helped pay for the war against your people. And that flow has begun to dry up. The Draconic Queen borrowed a lot of money from the Allfather and bought some of it. A lot more she simply cancelled the sales to our nobles, and it hit our national purse strings hard. Things got petty and our council in its wisdom, namely Yvonne, Dominic, and Maximilian, decided that if she wanted to travel through our lands, she had to do so on a path we specified, which was very roundabout. I suppose it put her in the path of the Elf King. Do you think they were hoping that would happen, to get rid of her? Maybe even told him where she was? Nu asked, and Raymond was for a brief time still. I doubt it. If they did, they didn't tell me about it. Dominic controls the Aganti secret police, but even as rash as he is, he wouldn't do that. No, definitely not, Raymond concluded. Sometimes things just have unexpected results, and this is one of them. Nua raised a brow, clearly skeptical. She didn't press the matter, I suppose. She let the thought dangle unfinished and looked out the window of the carriage. The city was the definition of booming, with countless figures going to and fro, most notably with construction and farming equipment, but there was no shortage of commercial goods loaded on wagons. The smell of animals and large numbers hung in the air and caused her to wrinkle her nose. She shut the curtain with a snap of her wrist. I swear, if I were ever to run a city, I will put public baths on every city block, and require that animals be washed at least once a week. Nua pinched her nose for emphasis, and it drew a laugh from the cardinal. I suppose I would too if I had your sense of smell. Raymond answered, but it won't be so bad. The main estates are in the city center and we're meeting in one of those. You're really not worried I'll just ask for asylum? That I'll throw myself at their mercy and hope they take me in? Maybe in exchange for information? Nu asked the cardinal, who sat across from her on the far side of his seat. Raymond's deep brown eyes found hers. If you really think they'd do so, I won't even object. I'll let them take you away without a fight, without a single word of protest. But after that, you'll always be hunted. The Aganti are trained from birth for their work. They're not scripture members, but they're dangerous spies and killers. They've kept the Dark Elves disunited for generations and murdered every heretic they've ever found. Maybe you'll be safe. I hope for it. But you'll always be wondering if the merchant you buy from has poisoned your food or if a knife is coming at you in the dark. Nua didn't shiver. I understand. I'll play my part. For now at least. She replied, but you have to promise me again. You won't let Dominic have me. I haven't been myself for over 100 years. I'd forgotten how good this feels. She slid across the seat so that they were closer to one another, leaned forward and grabbed his thighs, her nails digging into his skin between the fabric. I can't go back to the way I was. I'll kill myself before I do. Dominic will never lay a hand on you again. Raymond answered. He covered her hands with his. You asked if I'd have helped a wounded dog, and I didn't answer you then. The answer is yes. And if I do that, I'll help you. She closed her eyes. Now, let me get into character, Nua said, and Raymond watched, almost feeling the change in her as her body posture shifted in subtle ways before his eyes. Before long they were entering the small noble estate and were led to a large double door seemingly carved out of a single piece of wood. Nua stood one pace behind him to his left. Master, she said when she saw his side look at her. She graced him with a reassuring little smile. I've attended meetings of the powerful before, I know proper etiquette. I won't shame you. That wasn't what I was worried about, Nua. Not at all. Raymond answered, but thank you for saying that. Aurelian slept in his rocker, with Kalka's hand slowly pushing and pulling. The little bassinet was fit for the Prince of Two Kingdoms, carved out of one giant dragon's tooth. The curve was nearly perfect. The inside of it was lined with silk with down stuffing and tiny, hand-carved springs to make for great comfort. His blanket and pillow were no less luxurious, and unsurprisingly, he slept like it. Gustave Montagnier stood at hand as the child's personal bodyguard as the royals sat in the manner of a dark elf lord appointed by Albedo herself. The estate was relatively new, being in a new city established for those dark elves and other slaves liberated by treaty with the Kingdom of Nazarick. Countless dark elves and humans dwelled in the area, with numerous buildings rising up even 2 years after the Great Victory, or debacle, depending on preference. This estate held numerous treasures that, at a glance, Ainz suspected were lifted from the former masters' homes. The nobles Albedo appointed, he himself had largely rubber-stamped, trusting to her judgment, and given the orderly nature of the bustling city, she seemed to have been right. Their host made himself scarce, and the totality of the royal party of 5 nations sat at ease with one another, waiting on the 6th. The double door swung wide and Raymond entered the room. The other monarch stood until the elf at his back approached his chair, drew it out, and pushed it beneath him so that he could join the others. Nua's scribal kit was out and ready, as were those of other kingdoms, and Albedo rose to her feet. "Now that we're all here, we have something," the radiant All-Mother said and slid a stack of documents to her left. It passed from one pair of hands to the next until it made its way back to her with only one copy remaining. Raymond looked down at the document, skimmed it, then leaned back and handed it to Nua. "That will go straight to the cardinals," he said in a hushed voice so as not to interrupt his counterparts. Nua accepted the document without question. The scribal kit she carried was a simple device, a strap looped over her neck and a small box that curved on one side that rested against her waist to keep it flat. Within the box a scribe would carry ink, quills, paper or parchment, and other materials to be brought out at need. The side of the box held small tight cups into which the inkwells and quills fit snugly to allow repeated access to the box for fresh paper. She stored the document within and laid a blank sheet down to begin to write as Albedo spoke. "A few days ago our servants in our window took notice of a column of smoke rising within the center of the city, and some of our more astute observers noted the smell of burning flesh. A funeral pyre. Of course we had them inquire about who lived there, as we should offer condolences to any noble family in the city while we are present. Only to find it was occupied by, of all things, a delegate for the tournament. Albedo let them take that in, and scribes for various kingdoms began taking their own notes in turn." "Elf delegates," Albedo said emphatically. "But the Elf King wouldn't send someone there, and how could he reach it that fast?" Calco objected. The room focused their attention on Raymond. "He wouldn't. But he might go there himself," the cardinal said and crossed his hands together one over the other on the table. "That monster loves only one thing. Rape." The Frost Queen hissed the word like a curse. "Yes. But he doesn't do it for no reason. He wants strong heirs. The last time he ventured outside of his country it was to kidnap one of our strongest warrior women expressly to force her to bear his child," Raymond explained, and Ainz perked up. "This sounds very familiar," he thought and began to rub his jaw. "Other than that, he never leaves his kingdom, capital, or even palace." Raymond's hands tensed. "It is possible that we all made a grave mistake." The cardinal cleared his throat again. "This tournament will no doubt have many warrior women. A temptation like that would be too much. The Elf King may have taken Queen Draudillan, but if he did, and I believe that is what happened, then she isn't in the Elf Kingdom. She is in our winter." "You think she's in that estate, don't you?" Queen Rena guessed immediately. "Then that is where we go to rescue her and her surviving party." The Queen of Frost rose to her feet as if the matter were settled. "Wait, Queen Baraha," Ainz said and held a palm out. "My wife asked a pertinent question, one that the cardinal hasn't answered." Naya stopped, and slowly, reluctantly sat. Cardinal Raymond exhaled a loud breath and said, "This is a state secret that you're asking me to divulge. You want us to rescue your ally. We should know what we're up against, or will you put the Queen at greater risk, Cardinal?" Albedo pointed out. "Do you not have authority to determine what your neighbors should know?" Ainz asked. "You were endowed with the right to represent your nation's interests, weren't you?" he asked, and Raymond felt his spine tingle with the Allfather addressed him. The foreign monarch's voice and manner, everything about him was almost seductively appealing, entrancing. Like he was the perfect monarch. "You're right. The Elf King is a monk of supreme power. We rescued our own from him only by way of distraction. No attempt at assassination has ever worked. We can't pierce his skin, He's shrugged off spells that have killed monsters that guilds rated 90 to 100 or more. You wonder how he got to our winter so quickly. The most powerful monks we have can imbue their energy into a living thing for a few minutes. But the Elf King can do it for hours. If he imbues energy into horses, then they can run at full speed for an extended period of time. If he does it frequently, Raymond snapped his fingers. He'll arrive anywhere he wants, quickly. The Cardinal swallowed. This information must not leave this room. Speaking to some of you is something every fiber of me tells me I should not be doing, let alone revealing this. If my comrades ever learn what I'm about to say, I'll be disgraced, cast out, and possibly even charged with treason. Even though I'm empowered to speak for my government, this won't be overlooked. I'm putting my life in your hands as a leap of faith. With two non-human rulers, Queen Barahu asked, her wings spread a little as if to emphasize her inhumanity, and whether intended or not, the All-Mother did the same. Must you rub it in? Raymond asked. I have had time to think. It doesn't matter what, not now. What matters is that the only lawful heir to the Draconic Kingdom's life is at stake. Now can I trust you or not, Frost Queen? The delegates cast their eyes about at one another, and one by one they answered. You can. And he appears to be a god. On par with one, at least. Raymond spat the words out. He produced one child of great power, more powerful than our most powerful godkin. This is not possible unless he is like the six. An elven god. Part of why we progress so slowly with the elves is because we do not actually want to fight him. Could you draw a portrait of him? Ein said as he leaned forward. What is the Elf King's actual name? Does he have one? We assume he does, but we've never heard it. He only calls himself the Elf King and nothing more. Raymond answered the question. As far as drawing him? I'm not much of an artist, but I can try. He held his hand up and Nua wordlessly removed a blank piece of paper and handed it to him along with a quill already dipped in ink. Raymond's hand flew over the paper. The scratch of the quill was quick to the extreme, and when he was done, he blew gently on his work and gave it a quick nod of approval. He handed it to the Golden Queen, who passed it around until it reached the Allfather. You sell yourself short, Ein said as he looked down at the portrait he'd been given. It's not half bad. I never thought I'd see this face again. You know him? How? Raymond asked, and for a moment the Allfather said nothing. He came from the same place your gods came from, if the relics you have are any indication. Ainz answered him without really thinking. He was recalling the battle with the Elf King when the guild was young. He was so lost in thought that he said nothing and did not look up until Albedo's hand touched his shoulder. My husband? She asked, and Ainz cleared his throat before setting the paper down. You put your life into my hands to help rescue the Draconic Queen, Cardinal Raymond. I won't forget it. So, in that spirit, one secret for another. I'll tell you how I know him, and where I know him from. What you choose to do with that information, I leave to you. Settle in. This is quite a story. Ainz added, and looking around to the various secretaries he added, but they must leave. Not mine. Raymond replied. She does not leave my side. Nua took one step closer to him, and for a moment, as the other secretaries filed out, a battle of wills, weighing and measuring one another's intents raged between them. It's like that, is it? Very well, Ainz said, and took a deep breath to begin. Volume 7 C85. Ainz looked away as if deep in his memories, recalling the stories of his guild days. The Elf King, as I said, is not of this world. Nor am I. I am from another world, beyond the one he came from. My friends and I used his world as a kind of hunting ground. I believe the ones you refer to as players are like me, like my friends. Though they must have been weaker if they chose not to kill him. My friends' creations and mine refer to that original world as First World. We would travel to the Second World, a world of First World's creation. It was a place for us to play games, to hunt, to explore what each other made. We waged battles and forged bonds. Second World, it was the happiest time of my life. Traveling worlds, it may seem strange to you, as it was to me when Ainz briefly swallowed his heartache before he chose to incorporate Demiurge's story into his account. When I first found this world in the most ancient of times, before we sealed everything away, protecting this world from the evils of its own making. In this second world the Elf King, as you call him, had a kingdom of his own, and my friends and I? The 9 of us killed him, Hines explained, and Raymond felt his body become as stone. The spell he used. It makes sense, perfect sense. Raymond realized as he began to put the pieces of the puzzle together. You said you killed him, was he resurrected? The Cardinal's mind ran faster than an arrow loosed from a bow, and Hines answered him. No. He could not be permanently slain. Once killed, he would revive again after a set time period. He has been killed many times, Hines explained, and despair briefly washed over Raymond and Noah alike. Will be his playthings forever, Noah thought, her stoic eyes held steady, but without thinking about it, she put herself a hair closer to Raymond when the thought came to her. No. That was in Second World. He can be permanently killed here, Hines said and pressed his forefinger against the table to reference the new world. More importantly, I can kill him. Are you, perhaps, a god? Raymond asked. Kalka and Albedo's backs stiffened at once and Albedo's wings spread out to their maximum extent. With the impassioned voices of offended royal women they rebuked the Cardinal by almost shouting, "Of course he is." The table waited after that. It wasn't hard for even Raymond to know why. They're waiting for me to erupt. Waiting for me to start shouting about blasphemy and that I was expecting him to deny something so outlandish. But the Cardinal's thoughts were busy ones, agitated ones. He began scratching on the surface of his hand as if it itched. You may be. My whole life I served the Six. I did it to protect mankind, because it was the only way. The only way I knew at least. But we know the Six came from another world, and that others, the demon gods, the greed kings, they came here from somewhere else. Another player, another god? It isn't beyond possibility. It was almost a relief to acknowledge the buried truth that at the least, a new god was a possibility. If you are a god, you're different from the ones I know. My own loathe the undead, except for the death god, you use them as tools. My own. They protected humanity. You protect. Raymond's body felt weak. If he'd had to stand, he couldn't have managed it. He looked over his shoulder to the elf who stood close at hand. You protect more. The greater the god, the more he can guard. The Queen of Frost answered. So you believe him to be a deity, then? Raymond as the Frost Queen. I've never met a god. Naya answered, her vertical slit pupils hidden briefly by a blink. I don't know if I'd recognize one if I did. I only know that I protect my people as best I can. I have a lot of types of people. Humans, elves, orcs, goblins, snake people, dwarves, and more, so many more. The Allfather has the same. A more natural alliance than one with his kingdom, I can't imagine. If it takes calling him a god to secure us, I'll go with that. And if he can accomplish it? That's good enough for godhood as far as I'm concerned. If someone else wants to argue the point, let them show up and do it. A lot of words there for yes. Raymond muttered, and the Frost Queen flashed a fang-filled smile in his direction. Okay, then yes. I suppose I'm starting to think that way. Nothing else explains what I've seen. The Frost Queen drummed her talons on the table, but otherwise fell silent after giving him her answer. Raymond took that in. I saw your power at the Katsa Plains. I wondered then if I was seeing a new god rising in the world. But this is still a lot to think over. There's time enough for that. But for now, we need the Queen rescued. Thankfully the Elf King is as dense as he was in Second World. Albedo, Hines looked up to his right, send a distraction to the Elf King, and have the Queen removed to Nazarick at once. Wait. No. Plan? That's it? Raymond asked, snapped out of his reverie by the abrupt order, his eyes wavering from Allfather to Allmother. I was created to be the ideal administrator, so of course I can handle something as simple as a minor rescue. Albedo's feathers ruffled just a little, which led to Raymond's eyes goggling. You're a golem? He gasped out the word, only for the pregnant golem to laugh uproariously. Putting a hand on her ample chest she tried to regain control over herself. No, silly human. I'm a living being, not some petty golem. My creator was one of the 41, whom my beloved Lord led. Each of the 41 supreme beings created living things to serve them. I am one of those beings. The unworldly beauty of the winged woman beside the Allfather was all too believable in what she said. A god. Raymond thought the words, and it grew ever more likely in his mind. So then, What did you want to meet with me for? Why are we gathering at all? Raymond asked as he regained his mental footing. First, our agents will be collectively withdrawn from your country, the Golden Queen said at once. Even my goblins, the Wolf Queen added when Raymond glanced her way. But there's another problem, the Frost Queen said, her lips drew thinly across her face, and Raymond felt his heart pick up its pace just a little. The things our agents have seen of your country, the treatment of your slave population, the stories about it are spreading through our ranks. And more than that, by your own admission, the Draconic Queen's capture is on your country's head. It wouldn't have happened if you had properly guarded her, or even just permitted a more direct route. Calca quipped. Raymond sat silent. There was nothing he could say, all his theology, all his training, all his apologetics and defenses. He looked over at Nua, who stood so close he could smell the fragrance of her hair. It was forgotten. It fell away in the memory of her desperate terror when he was grabbing for her ear to make the cuts that would mutilate her very identity. What do you want? Raymond asked the question without any hint of a diplomatic flourish. A change in policy for your country. Ines answered for the lot of them. I can't do that. I'm here to represent, not to rule. Raymond protested at once. He opened his hands out to stop his scratching on the skin and spread them out in front of him. You know this, you all know this. But you can tell your comrades. The Wolf Queen pointed out. Things will carry on for now, but send word home while you're here, and please understand, when we return to our respective nations, our relationship with your country will change. Mine will be the first to make that happen, I promise you. Henry's eyes were hard and fixed on the Cardinal, the lingering question on her mind. Did he authorize the slaughter of my village? Is he one of the ones who made that happen? Just sitting close to him, she longed to claw out his eyes, but this was a start at least. I will have something drawn up, Raymond said and pushed himself upright, giving himself a few seconds to steady himself. He then said, Nua, come with me, we're leaving. There's nothing more to be done here. The Cardinal then gave a polite half-bow with his hand over his chest, and left them behind as he exited. I think that went very well, Ines remarked when the Cardinal was gone. Now Albedo, Ines said when no one ventured to disagree, see to the Draconic Queen, and afford her every courtesy of Nazarick until I arrive to speak with her myself. At once, my love. And with that, the table rose as one. Volume 7 C86. Draw Dylan sent up her smoke signals yet again. I can only hope somebody is watching. The heat of the fire was such that she turned her face back and forth, her arm ached with exhaustion and with pain from the fire's close proximity. But she endured. The sound of low moans that weren't there drove her on. Her fears, her imaginings, her dread and regret took physical form in the sweat on her brow and the ache in her limbs. But the hidden queen kept it up, watching the brief billowing again and again. Draw Dylan. Here. Draw Dylan. Here. She did it from multiple fireplaces around the estate. But for days, nothing changed. Tend the fire, whelp, the Elf King said when it started to diminish. This was his new favorite way to taunt her. Yes, master, the Queen said and rushed to the little wood bin. She struggled to hold as much as she could, teetering around on her small feet, leaning back to keep it from falling. My toe hurts, she thought, sure it was bleeding from where a log landed on it minutes ago. She crouched down and began heaping logs on the diminishing flames. Not that way. You need practice, the giant elf said from where he sat. Yes, master, the Queen said and got to all fours to place one log at a time into the ornate fireplace. She could feel his eyes on her. If I weren't disguised, would I have ended my life? She wondered about that, for had done so, not counting the one to die the day of their capture. The question haunted her nights, and she began to shake as if his eyes had the piercing power of the sharpest blades. Please, she prayed, someone, please. You'll give me many strong children when you grow up, whelp. The Elf King grunted the statement. I can feel the magic welling inside you. I prefer fighters more, but I'll take a useful magic caster just as quick. He licked his lips. Are any of your mother's whores carrying yet? He asked, and Draudilin dropped the log into place with a thud. She shoved some tinder into place to rekindle the flames and began tugging the flue at once. I think maybe, master. I will ask. It is hard to tell with humans this early. I can use magic to find out if it pleases you, she said as she went up to her knees and continued to send her smoke signal into the air. The heat was scalding her hand as she held the metal rod. Unlike the one in the women's quarters, this one didn't have a convenient chain. The lever was close to the flames. I've got to call for help, she cried out in her head as sweat began to pour down her forehead and her arm from the effort. I see. That would be good, he groused. There's no sense losing any whelps until I know if they're useful or not. Fine, have the magic casters check the stock. Yes, master. The queen kept her eyes down and repeated the smoke signal words, draw Dylan. Here. Why are you doing that, whelp? He asked her as she continued the process. Master, the fire needs more or it will die. She hastened to answer, I can stop, if master wishes, but the fire will start to die. Her eyes remained on the floor, and he seemed to consider her words. No. Keep at it, a burn on your hand is nothing. It isn't your hands I need, he chuckled and licked his lips, looking directly at her face as he did it. I will, sir. I will, the queen replied until the shouting reached her. The Elf King's face changed, she could see it out of the periphery of her vision. His lustful thoughts went to the only other emotion he seemed to know other than anger. Contemptuous annoyance. Useless trash, what are they shouting about? He snarled. Undead. The screams came up just as the noise of a distant wall caving in rang out over the estate. You whelp. Get back to the harem. My guards are so worthless. The Elf King spat on the polished floor, and as towering as he seemed before, even though he grew not an inch, he seemed somehow more so. The queen didn't argue, she shot to her feet and sprinted, her little child-sized heart pounding as fast as she could make it as her bare feet ate up space over the shining polished floor until she was at the safest place in the estate. Unless the Elf King wanted someone there. She rushed past guards who were streaming in, their shouted voices went up, and suddenly the true malicious genius of the Elf King, in this one thing at least, was obvious. The elven warriors took up position in the hall, drawing bows. The noise of the curving came out all at once as they acted in sync. Those who bore swords brought them to bear beside shields. They were not guarding the Elf King's harem, they were guarding their wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters. Nobody would suffer or die for the Elf King, but for their own. That malignant monster. The queen cursed as she ran down the hall. The warriors made sure she had a path clear before closing up the way behind her with their bodies so thickly barring the way that when she looked back, she saw nothing beyond their ranks. Worthless. The Elf King's booming voice came out as his fist smashed something. The sound of a great shield fell with a clatter and a howl of hatred went up before he destroyed some form of creature out of her sight. What's happening? Dozens of voices, human and elf alike, went up from the great open chamber. The undead, somewhere. Draw Dylan answered, and a wail of horror went up. We're in hell. From monster to undead, how can this not be hell? The elder elven woman cried out, and without thinking, she reached down and grasped Draw Dylan in her arms, whirling the young girl around to protect the little human royal using her own back to do it. Which was why Draw Dylan was the first to see it. The whirling vortex appeared within spitting distance just as the Elf King's distant bellowing cut off another undead scream. From within the void stepped a face she knew. Grey-faced and squared, regal to the point of perfection as servant or ruler alike, dressed in his fine butler's clothing. Queen Draw Dylan, we have received your message and have come to retrieve you. I trust you have no objections? Sabos said as he took a very gracious bow. The elves looked at the human with a mix of fear, relief, and suspicion, eyes darting about, sweat sprang onto everybody. The queen isn't here. Her daughter is. And I won't give her to someone who just. The matronly elf who clung to the queen in disguise stopped speaking when Draw Dylan whispered, let me go. She disengaged herself gently from the elf woman, and her body, her curves, her bosom and body from head to toe, returned to her proper age. Lord Sabos. It's good to see you, I have no objection but one. I will not go alone. I'm afraid I have no time to argue, my lady. Sabos replied. Gasps from the elven women were many as the child became a woman before their eyes, but Draw Dylan did not give them time for questions. Then you have no time to say no, they are mine. All of them. They go first, and I follow, she said and met the face of the butler of steel with stern resolve. You are the queen I remember. So be it. If they refuse, however, we go alone. Sabos answered. Draudilin made her address to the harem very brief. Sabos is a friend, a good one, and he is our rescue. I've tended your bodies, your wounds, fed and washed you. I know I've hidden my true state. But please, trust me. Go through that gate and we will never be reachable by that bastard ever again. They rose, they hesitated, staring from the gate to her and then to Sabos and then to one another. The distraction will not last much longer. Sabos pointed out. If you want to still be here when the Elf King finishes off those Death Knights, stay behind. Draudilin reported. The humans who knew her best and who were familiar with Sabos by sight if not by name, were already rushing toward the vortex. That set off the rest, and a stream of elves began charging the gate as fast as they could move, streaming around Sabos and Draudilin until they vanished from view. The elf warriors turned as soon as the noise of it all hit home, and Draudilin pointed to them. Do you want to explain to him how you lost all your women? She asked. Thus did the Elf King's methods reveal their weakness. No one wanted to deliver the news, it was as good as capture, and the elf warriors followed after their women, looking behind them as they trudged like captives rather than ran like the liberated, and they too, vanished into the void. Now I will go with you, and I hope I will see your master soon. The queen said as she stepped beside the butler and bent her arm at her side. He linked his arms with hers as if escorting a lady to a ball, and vanished into the gate. It closed at their backs, leaving the crackling fire with nobody to warm at all.